So we're here again with the Indigenous Studies Social Media Series. I'm here with Dr. Sarah Deer. It's an honor to be talking with you.
Thank you.
You're an alumni and you're also faculty, so you kind of exist in a lot of different spaces in relationship to KU. And we've talked to quite a few people like that, so I think that's really encouraging because we have this really kind of deep sense of community here in Lawrence, you know?
Right.
And so I guess let's kind of start there. Let's kind of talk about your journey with KU and how KU might have shaped you, if you would. Who do you come from, Dr. Deer?
Well, I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, but I was raised in Wichita, Kansas.
Okay.
Very fortunate growing up. My parents, were able to provide everything that I needed when I was growing up. And but yet I didn't have much contact with my tribe because, of course, it was several hours south.
Sure.
So I would say it was when I was a law student here at KU that I really came into my own in terms of focusing on Indigenous issues, particularly issues related to Indigenous women and Two-Spirit communities.
Right.
And so I began studying Indian law here back in the late 90s. It changed my life in a way because when you don't grow up on a reservation, there's so many things you don't know about how the law works and mostly how the law doesn't work. Right. And so I was definitely getting my eyes opened to the reality of what sovereignty means in the 20th and 21st century and sort of the role that lawyers play in sustaining that sovereignty, holding on to every little bit that we've got. So then I left Kansas in 1999 when I graduated from law school, and I had 3 other jobs, one in Washington, D.C., one in Los Angeles, specifically West Hollywood, and then my first teaching gig in Minnesota. And a couple years ago, I was so honored to be the Langston Hughes visiting professor here. And while I was here, I developed a lot of relationships. There was a lot of nostalgia, too, because there are some things that are exactly the same as they were 25 years ago when I arrived. And other things, just kind of blew my mind. So, for example, the first date that I went on with my husband was at the Java Break.
Oh, my God.
And I don't think the Java Break has changed one. They have a cereal bar now.
Right.
But they didn't have that cereal bar then. But other than that, it's like a time capsule or something. So KU was interested in having me return as a faculty member, and I was really excited about the opportunity. This is my home, and this is where all the intellectual things started for me. So between the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and the School of Public Affairs and Administration, I received a job offer, and I think I accepted it the same day it came to me. So I was pretty excited to come.
Oh my God, that is such a fascinating story, Dr. Deer. It's really funny. Just on a personal note, the Java Break is like my favorite coffee shop in town.
Oh yeah.
And it's when I came to Haskell in 2012. It's like one of the first places I went to in town.
Yeah, I think I'm probably too old for that scene now. But when I was 20, that was the place to be.
Right.
Like if you were cool and you were reading edgy stuff, like you go to the Java Break. But it's that kind of nostalgia that I developed over the years. And I think when I left KU, I think I needed to leave. You know what I mean? Like, I think that if something would have happened where I would have stayed here, I'm not sure I would appreciate it as much. It was bouncing around the country for a few years that made me really understand that KU is the place that I want to be.
I think that's really profound. As Indigenous people, how do I say this? We sometimes get couched in our home communities, and it's a place of comfort, So it's cool to see a lot of especially like prominent Native scholars seem to have a similar story of like going out and getting a perspective.
Right.
And I think that speaks to a lot of traditional practices as well. I think a lot of tribes would do that, get their members worldly before they
then come back and help.
Exactly. So. If you don't mind my asking, what were your other jobs and how did they kind of shape you at post KU?
Oh, so I think they all, there were pros and cons for all the jobs that I took. So the very first job I took was with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow.
Like, don't mess around, just
go.
So literally, the day after the bar exam here, I took it in Topeka. in the summer of '99, I got on a plane and I moved to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Now, my father at that time was the Clinton appointee to the chair of the National Indian Gaming Indian Gaming Commission,
Right.
the regulatory body, not the trade organization.
Sure.
And so he was already living there, specifically in Arlington.
Sure.
So when I moved my life out there, it was my dad's roommate. Isn't that great?
That's amazing.
So we lived in Arlington, and we both worked in downtown D.C., and he was with the Gaming Commission, and I was at the Justice Department. And then my fiance joined us, moved on out. He closed his legal practice here in Lawrence and decided to move out to D.C. And so the three of us lived together in a townhome in Arlington. And I worked in the Justice Department, specifically in the Violence Against Women office. And my work really centered around monitoring and helping tribal nations with their VAWA funding. And so there's no better education than that. I got to travel around every week to meet with different tribal leaders, go to different reservations, go to Alaska, and just talk to people about the things that I was passionate about. So it didn't seem very burdensome. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for me.
Wow, that is, I don't know that there is a better job for that kind of work,
Well, it depends on who's in the White House. And so, after I was in the Reno Justice Department, and then there was an election, you may remember, in 2000. Yes. There was a little stuff going on around that. And so we had a new leader, John Ashcroft, who became the Attorney General. And it wasn't overnight that things changed. It was very gradual. But soon I found myself being more frustrated with my work than enjoying the work, because there were a lot of anti-Indian sentiment.
Sure.
Was presenting in a way that I was struggling with, and I didn't feel like I was really accomplishing much in that department. So that's when I moved to West Hollywood, the kind of last place a Kansas girl ever expects to be.
Right.
And I went there with my husband because there's a nonprofit, an Indian-owned and operated nonprofit in West Hollywood called the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Okay. And it was a small nonprofit at the time. It's since grown quite a bit. So I moved there in 2002 and was the victim advocacy legal specialist for that nonprofit. Now, I was working with VAWA funding, but I was working from the other end. So now I was a recipient of the funding, and was able to have a little bit more leverage and a little bit more independence to sort of craft programs right. in the way that I thought they needed to be crafted. And the reason we were in West Hollywood is because my boss and the founder of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and his partner, Gay, obviously this is his partner, and they had been living in San Francisco most of their adult lives, but they found it was a very expensive place to live. So this is what cracks me up. They moved from San Francisco to LA right. to save money. But so often people say, what is a tribal organization doing in West Hollywood? Well, that's why. And, of course, Los Angeles has a vibrant right. urban Indian community that people often, if you're not from Southern California, it wouldn't occur to you. But right. there are a lot of Indians in L.A.
Well, and it's just to interject, I mean, the native population in the Bay Area seems to be very Oakland-centric rather than yeah. San Francisco. And so, yeah. You move where the community kind of needs you,
yeah,
kind of thing.
Yeah,
so.
And so when I was in LA, then I was actually appointed by the mayor to be on the, I think the mayor advisory committee on Native issues.
Wow.
And I was just brand fresh off the boat, I didn't know. LA was kind of a shock to me, but I tried to be part of that community as well.
So that's, you're pre-Minnesota, right? That's kind of like you leading up to Minnesota.
Yeah.
And that's, as I've gotten to know you or I know about you as a collegiate scholar, I've known you as being up in Minnesota. Yeah. And so yeah. how was that transition working in these cool spaces in West Hollywood where you're doing this real concrete work and then kind of going back to academia a bit, right, up in Minnesota?
Yeah. So it was kind of, it's a little bit of a bumpy story, but I'll tell it and you can edit it.
Sure.
So my husband was pretty unhappy in LA. I think we both were. We were both from Kansas, and all of the sunshine and the glitz and the stars and it just was a little over the top. And so he had actually gone back to school to get his library science degree.
Okay.
Because we call ourselves recovering lawyers. Not to diss the profession, but just kind of where we enter it.
Right.
And so he decided he really enjoyed researching law. He just didn't really enjoy practicing it. So he went back to UCLA and got an information science degree. And at that point, he had gone where I was going, right? So he followed me to DC, he followed me to LA, and he said, when I finish my degree, I want you to follow me because we're not staying in LA, which was understood. So the very first job interview he got the offer, and it was at a small law school in Minnesota. I have my mom's family is from Minnesota.
Okay.
So we packed up again and we moved to Minnesota. And then I was still working for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute out of a Minnesota office.
Okay.
Because we had branches at that
That's so
time.
cool.
But then I got really sick. I had cancer. And I was very young. I was 33. And so I went through, pretty lengthy treatment and lots of surgeries and things like that. And it was during that time period that I started to sort of recalibrate what I wanted to do with my life. I had been traveling far too much and it wasn't sustainable. And so I thought, well, maybe if I could get a teaching job, at least that would force me to stay put so that I would be teaching. It doesn't really matter because I still really travel as much as I ever did. But I decided to ask. I didn't have any experience teaching. A lot of people had told me that I should be teaching, including Stacy Leeds, who was here at KU for quite a while. And she encouraged me. And I had other Native legal academicians, law professors from around the country who really encouraged me to teach. So I dipped my toe in the water and splashed in. I got a job offer at the school where my husband worked and started teaching law and fell in love with it from day one. I didn't know if I'd like it or not. But it was the opportunity to shape minds and to learn from students, and it was just, I found the classroom to be a really exciting place to be. So I haven't looked back since then. I think I'm in the right career finally.
Wow, well, that is a journey, Dr. Tier. Obviously we're highlighting all of our KU Indigenous people. And education is a big focal point in a lot of the stories. Some people will have a kind of arm's length relationship to it, but I feel like a lot of Indigenous academics really, I don't know, kind of go all in once they find it.
Right.
And so after Minnesota, what kind of prompts you to come back to KU? What kind of makes you feel like this is the homecoming now?
Well, the law school where I was a standalone private school. There are not very many of those left. 90% of law schools are like here, right, where it's part of a university. But where I was, it was not. It's a standalone law school, and I feel so grateful that they took a chance on me because I didn't come with the traditional law school credentials. But after a time, I'm a very multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary thinker, and I was kind of finding myself stifled a little bit because it was like, well, there's not a history department down the hall, or there's not a women's studies department in another building, and so I was really stuck in this pretty tight box of legal academy only. And I started talking to my friend Elizabeth Kronk-Warner, who's at the law school here, and she said, well, let's see if we can get you here. And so she was the one that found the Langston Hughes opportunity. Right. And helped me, get that. So then I was here on campus. The law school at that time was not hiring, so I kind of thought, oh, darn, this isn't going to work out because I have a JD, not a PhD, so I'm kind of stuck in law. And then I found this department where we're sitting right now, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and they said, you have a JD, it's a doctorate, and we'd love to see what we can do. So it all kind of fell into place, and I think my husband was also interested in moving to having a more not just law, but to be able to be a librarian for all kinds of different disciplines. And so it just made the most sense to us to come back.
Well, that's so fantastic. I don't know. It speaks to, and especially kind of your motives. I feel like, and with the series, we have so many people coming from these different disciplines who are talking a lot of the same topics and a lot of the same themes. And I think it's funny. A lot of people, maybe from an outside perspective, will say, well, as Indigenous people, shouldn't you be focusing on this or on this to fix your problems? And I don't think that that's ever the right way of thinking for Indigenous people. We're multidisciplinary people by nature.
Right.
And so you've done all this work in law and academia, but then you're out there advocating for like women's rights and women's agency and power, right?
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about like how that's kind of actualized in your life and how you've, obviously you've done the Violence Against Women Act and the reauthorization of that. You were a spearhead of that. Where does that fight start for you, I guess, if I can ask that?
Well, I mean, it almost always comes back to Lawrence.
Right.
Almost always. So when I first moved here, I'm transferred to KU as a junior.
Okay.
So I didn't start college here, but I ended it here. And when I first got here, I was just 20 years old, the summer before my junior year, and I volunteered to learn how to be an advocate for survivors at what was then called the RVSS, or Rape Victim Survivor Service. And so I got trained, and a 40-hour training is pretty standard, and then I started helping survivors. And that it could include talking to somebody on the phone, meeting with somebody in person. We would go to the hospital if somebody reported assault and presented at the hospital. We also were able to support women during interviews with police, and then all the way through jury trials, like all the way through, everything from start to finish. And I think that really shaped or solidified that I wanted to work on these issues of women's empowerment. And of course, I ran into, I had the opportunity to work with Haskell students who had experienced assault. And so I was kind of doing that at the same time I was learning Indian law. And so these pieces were starting to come together for me.
Right.
And I've never really looked back. So even when I've been bouncing around doing DOJ and then nonprofit and then teaching, it all has been about that intersection for me of how Indian law perpetuates these colonial mindsets which present in ways that are horrific, with over 56% of Native women reporting that they have been a victim of sexual assault. That's 1 in 2. That's unacceptable.
Right.
So whatever job title I've had, that's been my focus. And a lot of people think it's a depressing place to be in my work, but I actually find it quite energizing and quite rewarding.
Right.
So I'm able to, not everybody wants to do that, but I found a way to make it a really balanced life, and one that's very, very fulfilling.
It's powerful realms that you're working in. That's kind of the only way I can say it. Because there are massive disparities, like you're saying. There are these huge inequalities in Indian country, and
right.
That notion that it's unacceptable is something that we have to be the ones to say, because you see the culture as it is right now. A lot of people aren't out there advocating from the outside. It has to be from the Indigenous perspective.
Right.
We kind of have to be the ones to be better. And so you're, to me, you're working in these really like concrete kind of spaces. You're out there doing the advocacy work.
Sure.
And you're at the same time, I'm sure you worked on policy, or you helped maybe consult with policy or something, and of course the Violence Against Women Reauthorization. What is our burden now as Indigenous peoples? Where do we go? What can we do outside of just making better policies and the like?
I mean, are you asking sort of what people can do with an Indigenous Studies degree or a KU degree, or
necessarily like what our people can do, not necessarily
Yeah.
just people from KU, but
Yeah.
you know, where do we go, like, as a whole?
Well, I think that we have to, I mean, I was talking to my students in my Native Feminisms class just yesterday about this, about damage-centered research and desire-centered research.
Right.
And so much of what I do, I mean, when I read this amazing article, which then I assigned to my students, by Eve Tuck about really rethinking and recasting how we do research with Indigenous communities, and coming at it from a place of strength rather than a place of weakness. And that's hard for me because I focus on sexual violence. But what I've been thinking about is we can flip the script to, oh, the poor Indians and the poor Indian women, and they're pathetic and they're raped all the time and they must be so sad and traumatized. And flipping that to say, what about the resilience of these women that despite the fact that they have been through something horrific, let's identify not what's wrong about what they've been through, but what is right about what they've done. And it really flips the script. And I think whether you're an academic or whether you're a student or an activist or somebody just living their lives with their family on a native reservation, it's like we've had enough people tell us that we're broken.
Yes.
And we've had enough people and researchers tell us that there's this like historical trauma that's always going to follow us around like a shadow. But nobody really asks or thinks about all of the great things that are going on in Indian country. And so that's really, I think all of us, regardless of where we walk in the world, can try to flip the script.
You know, we have these policies and laws and supposed protections, but the problems seem to be getting worse. What are these inequalities that are happening? You know, what are the weaknesses there, and how do we make those into strengths?
Yeah. Well, I mean, all the Violence Against Women Act for me has been about Title IX. It's a specific chapter within VAWA that focuses on the needs of Native women and Native communities. And what we've come up against is really not that surprising, that people don't want tribes to have more power. There's a sense of panic and sort of irrational fear, like, well, if the Native people have too much power, then they're going to use it to take revenge. I mean, some really stereotypical, really offensive sort of language coming out of the opposition. And so you have to keep your eye on the ball. Some folks that were opposed to tribal authority said some really, really offensive things about tribal court, and I actually kept all of them and wrote an article about it. I wanted to call it the dumbest things Republicans said about VAWA, but
we'll try to
rephrase that.
When we present this, we'll try to get a link to that. If we can.
Oh, yeah.
That would be great.
It's actually published by KU, so it's a book within a book that KU recently published. But I didn't call the chapter the stupidest things that Republicans said about VAWA. I said it much more diplomatically and sort of academically, I guess. But the kind of ignorance that we came up against, and not necessarily true ignorance, I think sometimes it was feigned ignorance, was really threatening to derail everything. And so the more we could try to find people from both sides of the aisle to come together, we had very little hope. And at that time there was only one Indian in Congress, and it's Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma. He's Chickasaw, and he was the one that broke the stalemate, because as a Native man, he knows the problems. He's from Oklahoma, and even though I think he's wrong on most of his other political stances, he got it. And if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have been able to succeed getting that bill reauthorized. So it's about finding your allies in places that you normally wouldn't look. It seems like all the Congress people from Oklahoma who are Indians are Republicans. So there is that, which is odd to me. But we got it done. And that was the most important thing at the end of the day. Well, I think I talked to my students in Native Feminisms about the utility of anger. So often, women in particular, but I think people of color generally are encouraged not to show too much anger. it's presented as something that's disruptive or dysfunctional. And yet, when people ask me, how do you work with sexual assault issues all day, or how do you work with ICWA, threats to ICWA all day, I said that core nugget of anger is actually useful.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you become enraged or that you live every day in anger. But when you're trying to figure out where to find the energy to deal with yet another onslaught of attack on Indigenous people, I think that anger is very useful because it can be energizing. And as long as you're in conversation with other angry people about it,
right.
You can police that a little bit so that it doesn't become the narrative of angry Indians, right? But it can be useful when you think, okay, where am I going to get the energy to write this brief to the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court is ready to strike down ICWA or whatever the case might be? Is that it becomes overwhelming and it can be paralyzing. So anger in an effective, useful type of anger, I think, needs to be cultivated.